better business, and a better life begin here. Welcome to Business is Art on True Chat with author and business consultant, John Umstead.
Thank you for tuning into Business is Art. Today, we are going to take a little bit of a detour from our typical types of shows that we do here. And we're going to talk about a topic that's, it can be business related, but we're not really going there. This is more personal. We do talk about how personal stories affect your business identity, perhaps even your brand. I've talked about that myself on this show before. We're going to step a little bit away from that and just stick to kind of that personal story. And in this case, we're talking about the topic of suicide. You know, we just completed or just finished the month of September, which was National Suicide Prevention Month. I recently blogged about suicide prevention on the Plan Canvas website. And my family is participating in a suicide prevention walk. It's entitled Walk Out of the Darkness Walk in Columbus, Ohio, this coming weekend. So this topic certainly has been on my mind for the last several months. It's actually always on my mind. It never kind of goes away because my family and I have been impacted fairly severely by suicide. So it never goes away, but sometimes it's bigger on our minds than at others. And this just happened to be one of those times. So we wanted to take a little bit of a time away on Business is Art and just talk about this topic, both from the aspect or angle of prevention as well as from around impact. So with me today are a couple of guests that if you are a fan of True Chat podcast, these gentlemen require no introduction, but I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves. They are fellow show hosts on the True Chat network. So take it away, guys.
Well, it's an honor to be here, John. Thank you. I'm Lance Jackson, and I was an educator for 32 years, 30 years in the public school system in high school and 2 years at the university level, and a coach for 34 years now and counting. So unfortunately, working with young people, I've had situations that I've had to deal with, both where young people unfortunately did commit suicide, but also the ability to get them help and get out of it. So it's tragic when it happens, but I think people are more aware now than they were when I first started teaching about the social pressure on young people as far as, and phones, electronic devices have just changed the ball game tremendously.
Yeah. I want to come back to something you just said, but let's go ahead and let Justin introduce himself. And then I would like to come directly back to something you just mentioned, Lance.
Well, I'm Justin T. Weller. I get the privilege of producing Business is Art on a weekly basis. And I get to talk with Lance on the State of Us, which we've been doing for in one form or fashion for almost 7 years now. So this November is the 7-year anniversary. Time flies, right? So, I think we're headed for 700 episodes right now. It's fair to say that Lance and I have talked about pretty much most things under the sun at this point, and this is one of them. John and I were looking before the show, just through the True Chat archives, and the State of Us, really, in comparison to other topics, we've only covered it a grand total of about 4 times during that history, and it's averaged a little less than once a year. So Lance and I think we spoke about this in response to an article from the Washington Post back near the beginning of the year that suicide rates had risen in all but one state between 1999 and 2016, with an increase seen across age, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. So I think that was the last time we talked about it, because it was just something that obviously caught our attention of, it isn't just, it isn't just short, it isn't just young people that are dealing with this. It's across all demographics. Yeah,
all demographics, all states. I mentioned that I recently blogged about suicide prevention. Again, it's at my website, plancanvas.net. If you go to the blog page, you will see a blog post entitled Out of the Darkness, Suicide Prevention. But in there, I provide some stats that were directly from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention or Prevention of Suicide. And just like you said, Justin, it has been on the rise across all demographics. The site included a map, so I copied it and put it in the blog post as well. So it shows a map of the U.S. and shades the states that have the highest rates of suicide. So there's 3 or 4 different shades. It was pretty interesting. So I'd really encourage you to go and look at that either at my website or at other websites. But something that jumped out at me, and Lance, I haven't forgotten, I do want to come back to you. But one of the things that jumped off the page for me was that suicide is actually highest among white middle-aged males. 7 of 10 suicides, which I did not see that.
Don't think I would have guessed that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the highest, but 7 out of 10. That's an amazing number.
Yeah, pretty crazy. But back to your point, Lance, how we are much more aware of it these days than we used to be. And I think back to times when I was in junior high and high school, and I can remember one incident in particular where one of the students' parents committed suicide, and I look back on that time and I just feel so ashamed and feel bad for her because it seemed like the entire student body just made fun of her and her family. There wasn't empathy for what had happened. Nothing like that. It was just like they were the dregs of society now because dad killed himself and she was trash for it. And I just can't believe that I actually was alive during a time that was the norm.
Just shows how old we are. Because,
yeah.
I mean, that was public perception.
It was.
30, 40 years ago, that was public perception.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
It breaks my heart to think about it. I just, I just can't. It's hard. I'd like to think I'm just not remembering things correctly, but I know I am. And, like I said, it's shameful that that's the way we were. I'd like to hear some stories from you guys. I've talked before. It's on my LinkedIn profile. It's all over my website. I kind of talk, not really ad nauseum, but I freely talk about how suicide has impacted my life and changed who I am as a person, or at least my direction and my personal sense of mission. And that really culminated with my nephew's suicide. And, but what I don't often talk about is that his suicide was actually the third in a fairly rapid string of suicides of people that were close to me. And the first was a friend. His name's David. And I will just never forget receiving that call. Just real quick story. So, I was having some health issues at the time, as was David, and we were both off work at the same period of time. In fact, I was in the hospital and, kind of drugged out of my mind, on morphine and things, and, in and out of consciousness for a week. I do remember waking up, periodically and seeing various people that were just kind of sitting in the room, keeping me company. And he was one of them. Even though he was, in kind of bad shape himself, he made it to the hospital and sat there with me. And, a couple of weeks later, I'm not in great health, but feeling better. He's still not feeling well. And, I remember sitting in my own backyard, summertime, and we're having iced tea. And I'm the kind of guy that in summer, I'd rather be sitting in the hot sun having a beer. Let's just be honest. So I'm sitting there having an iced tea because I had no choice. I couldn't have any kind of alcohol, because I wasn't well enough to have any, and he wasn't either. So he's having iced tea. And I just thought, is this it? Is this the rest of my life? Right. And I was feeling low, and I was feeling, I was having a little pity party for myself. And I knew he was as well. I just didn't know how deep his was, because 2 weeks later, I was finally cleared to travel for work, my first business trip after having been ill. And first day back on the road, on the job, and phone rings, and it was him. And I didn't answer it. I actually didn't even know the phone rang because it was my battery was dead, and so I didn't get it. But when I got into the office that I'd traveled to, plugged in, and the phone fires up, says I've got a missed call from David. I listened to the voicemail real quick, and it was very normal sounding. Just said, "Hey, I found out what's wrong with me after all this time. We finally figured it out. Give me a call. Let's play golf this Saturday." That was it, right? That was the call. A few hours later, I got a call that he was gone. He'd shot himself. And what actually had transpired was he was in his vehicle when he called me, and I had no idea this was going on because he was so calm. But he was actually being pursued by military police and sheriff's cruisers. Because he had been at a hospital, got into an argument with the doctors, disagreed with the diagnosis that they gave him, stormed out, and it was an alarming enough scene that the doctors called the MPs. And they tried to pull him over because they were worried about him. They thought he was going to hurt himself. Well, so anyways, he called me, hung up, pulled over, shot himself. And you would never, ever have guessed that from the tone of his voice in that voicemail. And to say that it really sent me reeling is a complete understatement. I'll just never forget the impact of the feeling that day. But anyway, that I had been otherwise fortunate enough to live my entire life without having been touched by suicide of anyone that was close to me until then. And then, boy, it just started in rapid succession.
Unfortunately, I think that's what happens too many times. And that is people don't seek help or share as much as they're struggling. So therefore, they think they're either handling it or they don't want to admit it for some reason. And because of the people that, one person, I think it's really a big thing when they tell you that they're thinking about it.
Right.
Because then they're looking for help. So many times, the other 3 times that I came in contact with it as a teacher, these were young people that nobody had a clue.
Right.
Mom and dad didn't have a clue.
Mm-hmm.
Their pastor didn't have a clue. Their friends didn't have a clue.
Right.
They looked like everything was okay. I mean, they had, boyfriend, girlfriend problems, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody wasn't on anybody's radar that that's where they were because they hid it so well. I don't know if that's the correct word to use, but they
didn't. As good as any.
They didn't go and seek any help, let anybody know what they were thinking. Yeah. I had one young man early in my career who came to me and said, "I'm getting ready to do this. I just want to talk to you."
Right.
And I invited him out to my home and we stayed up all night and I got him some help. But the other 3 were like out of the clear blue, like, really?
Right.
Kind of like you said, really? I mean, I just had a conversation with them a couple days before or the day before or whatever. And everything seemed fine. They weren't showing any outward signs of distress. And that I think that's what's so hard.
Yeah.
It is for me anyway, is that I would have done anything. Just let me know. And unfortunately, and I don't know what the statistics say, but it seems like that happens more times than not, than people really aren't aware. They're not letting anybody know. It's not that people don't care,
right?
But the person themselves aren't letting people know that they're having those kinds of thoughts.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is
which makes it really hard for us to help.
Yeah, very hard. There's shame involved with it. The person that's feeling that way feels ashamed or like a freak because they're having those sorts of feelings, not understanding or comprehending that a lot of us have those feelings. We all have dark days. We all have dark times. And a lot of people think, gosh, maybe the world would just be better off if I didn't wake up tomorrow, and that doesn't make you a freak. It makes you a human. And unfortunately, a lot of people just don't recognize that they aren't freaks. They aren't abnormal. They've got an issue and there are ways to work through them. So, anyway, there's a couple of other things I do want to come back to you with as well around education. But why don't we check in with Justin and see if he's got any stories he'd like to share. And hey, before we do, Justin, I'm sorry, I want to remind our listeners to get in touch with us, have a discussion with us. They can contact us out on social media at TrueChat.org. Again, that's TrueChat.org. Contact us through the website or through our app or any number of other ways. But let's have a discussion. Contact us. Let us know what's on your mind. Okay, thanks, Justin. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you're making my job easy, right? I don't have to remind you, so we just get that out of the way. I put up on the screen for Lance and John, for those of you obviously listening who can't see this, just something that I think, because we talk a lot about sympathy or empathy or compassion and how all that plays into this. And I found this graphic that I think does a nice job of explaining the progression of engagement. Pity being the first and small step, which is the I acknowledge your suffering. Sympathy being I care about your suffering. Empathy being I feel your suffering, or I appreciate it more because I've imagined myself in your place. And compassion being the next step and the final step of I want to relieve said suffering. And this infographic was created by Psychology Today, and I just thought it was apt because it can be for the people who themselves are not suicidal, but the ones who have, they either know somebody in the three of our cases, we know somebody who's committed suicide or know somebody who's maybe struggling with it. Thinking about that process and recognizing a lot of your reaction to it. That's to say that, one of the big debates that I struggle with a lot and not feeling like I've ever come to a sound conclusion, the whole it's my fault thing, the survivor guilt sort of thing. And survivor is not the right word. I don't know if I should I don't mean to use that in an offensive way to people who have been, assaulted or anything like that. But the people who are left behind, I think a common tendency, and I think it's hard not to experience it at some point, is did I say or do something wrong or did I miss something? And I don't mean this to sound harsh, but I think part of what we miss in the conversation is people jump to this, well, no, you didn't, you did everything you could. And there's two different things there, right? There's two different things. There's you did everything you could, and there's nothing else you could have done. And those aren't the same. And I think that breaking down one of the stereotypes that there's nothing else you could have done is almost always not true. And there are times where it is true, and where we truly didn't really miss anything because there wasn't anything to miss. But there are lots of times, where Lance was talking about, you have the cases where everybody's like, oh my gosh, this was out of the blue, and nobody really felt like there was any sign of even anything remotely like that. And then there's the cases where people are like, not very surprised by it, where it makes more sense. And I guess all I'm saying here is not that I have a single belief about this, just that I think it merits a conversation because it feels to me that it's often accepted that those two cases, we don't know, there was nothing suspicious versus there were a lot of signs, kind of get lumped together. And I think there can be a difference. As Lance had said, there's the people who are seeking help and there's the ones who aren't. And there's definitely,
and sometimes they seek help, and not to interrupt, but sometimes they seek help and still go through with it.
Right.
The medicine doesn't help, the talking doesn't help, and they still think it's the best choice for them to make. So, and at that point, maybe you have done, I understand what you're saying, but you maybe have done what you can do, and they're still going to choose to take their life. It's because, you're right. There's no, you can't put them all in groups because
that's I guess
they're
what I'm getting
almost
at.
singularly.
Yeah.
They almost happen individually or singular.
Yeah.
They all have their own little aspects.
Yeah. You guys both raise several points that I could talk for days on. I want to try to come back to them. But I also, again, want to remind our listeners that all of the podcasts, on the network pursue a common goal. True Chat's mission is to educate people, to provide honest, open, and respectful conversations. That's certainly what we are trying to do in this particular episode of Business is Art. But nonetheless, if you do have any ethical concerns with today's episode, please email ethics@truechat.org. Again, that's ethics@truechat.org. And again, our topic today, we're talking about suicide, both from the aspect of prevention as well as impact of suicide. So I think I'm going to try, if I can, to remember everything you guys just said. And I'm going to start with Justin and loop back to Lance. But, Justin, with respect to there was nothing I could do. This ties to something I want to go back to Lance with. I kind of fill in the blank. There was nothing I could do given what I knew at the time. And I think that's true very often. And what I knew at the time isn't limited to what I knew about the individual, isn't limited to what I knew about David or to an employee of mine named Tom who took his life, or to my nephew Nathan. But it also has to do with what I knew, or rather what I didn't know about suicide, about recognizing those subtle signs. And that kind of goes back to you, Lance, and that is prevention starts with education. It begins with removing the stigma, the shame that the individual feels, as well as to your point, Justin, the survivors, the shame that they feel, and guilt, because those feelings are all there. They're all there, and that they're illogical, but they are there, and you can brush them aside, but it's really hard to get rid of them. But the answer has to lie in education.
It's amazing how many times Justin and I have said that on our show. You want to solve a problem, educate people. It rings true in almost every situation that we've ever talked about.
Yeah.
And you're right. And it comes to the way you and I remember it being dealt with when we were much younger. I'm sitting here remembering the 1972 presidential election. I think it was Thomas Eagleton from Missouri was going to be the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats. And they found out that he had sought psychiatric help as a young man. And the stigma then was he had to withdraw himself from the nomination of the vice presidency. Right. It's like, well, somebody who's had psychiatric help can't be the leader of our country. And it's like, and I remember that, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. And, it came up, some of them talked about very little there, which was early 70s. But now it's like, wait a minute, it's an illness. It's like having cancer, or it's like having, and I'm not trying to put it into a death thing, but it is an illness. It's mental. We call it mental illness. Why can't you go see a doctor and have it treated and still be able to work within society? And again, it comes down to you have to educate people. Yeah. It can't be stigmatized. It can't be something that you push under the rug. The family doesn't talk about it because that's the dark side of our family. Right. Or that's, we just don't want everybody, we don't want our family linens to be aired in public. Yeah. And it's like, wait a minute, we need to talk about this so that more people are aware of it, so that we can stop it, so that we or alleviate some of the suffering that people have that make them go down this road and think that that's the best choice for them. Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more. I'm sorry. I don't mean to get on my soapbox. No, you said the key, education is
education. Education. That's right. And,
get the word out.
Yeah. And, we all kind of respond to things like suicide in similar fashions, but we also have different reactions and post event behaviors and how we deal with it going forward. And in my case, beginning with David, I started to really understand the impact of something as simple as a smile and a hello, how are you doing, and meaning it, not just being, passing, and that progressed over time. But that, I think, was kind of the beginning for me of really recognizing that those little subtle things could literally change a life, can literally save a life. So, not to get off topic, but you think about everything that is going on today in the United States, in our society, on social media, in the media itself, and politics, and just how nasty we get with each other. It's horrific, and it goes against everything that I stand for. And it's great to have and healthy to have disagreements and not all be homogenous. And how boring would life be if we were all the same and had the same opinion about everything. But when we take it to that next level where we're just really being disrespectful and downright mean to each other, it just doesn't sit well with me, because in part, maybe that's part of who I am just naturally, but I think also because of these experiences I've had where I really appreciate the power of a smile and a nice word.
It's I wonder if you ask people, if we just did a on the street survey. Lance and I did one of those not that long ago, collected a lot of responses. But I wonder if we ask people to say, list the top 10 causes of death in the United States. I would be surprised if most people listed suicide as one of them. It's the 10th. You have 45,000 suicides in 2016, which was more than twice the number of homicides. Homicides get a lot of press coverage, because, the drama, and obviously being very different, but you just wonder about, when we talk about education, most people, I doubt, know that, and that for people between the ages of 15 and 34, suicide's the second leading cause of death. So again, I wonder, do people really know that? If you said list the top 5 causes of death for people ages 15 to 34, does suicide make that? Because you think about, destigmatizing it. I think part of that is people understanding that it happens a lot more than sometimes it feels like, in part because of what Lance talked about, even though I think it's better today, the amount that we're able to talk about it. Lance and I have discussed that kind of catch-22 of the more mainstream we make it, then do we also risk increasing the acceptance of it being a feasible choice for people? And not to dive down that rabbit hole, because I think it's a different conversation. And I think generally it's accepted that no, it's definitely better to allow people to feel like they can have the conversation. And there's a lot of people studying this, obviously, but I just think, echoing that education point, it's one of those things that people just don't understand the prevalence of it, perhaps, because it is one of those things that it's nice, John, that you are open about it, but a lot of people aren't. If they have somebody like that, it's not one of those things, in part because, hey, it's not like, ooh, let's have fun talking about, the people that I know that have killed themselves. I mean, that's not, one of those things that people are like, yes, let's have that conversation. But at the same time, it's still one of those things that most people aren't going to be open about, maybe not intentionally hiding it, just one of those things they're like, you just don't. Yeah. It's not one of those things I'm just going to bring up in casual conversation, usually. Right.
You normally right. Don't. I've got a friend, I talked about how kind of I try to carry a certain torch in a certain way as my way of addressing the issue and trying to educate others. But a friend of mine, her name is Allie Doss. I know she wouldn't mind me using her name because she's been on several news programs out in the Kansas City area. But 3 years ago, her 15-year-old daughter took her life, and complete shock after it happened. And they found some evidence of what had been going through her daughter Sarah's mind. and found that it was actually a very rapid progression. It, like within a week, she went from being happy, fine, everything's good, to I can't live this way anymore. I mean, it was an extremely rapid progression. So they did not see it coming. But if they'd have seen any of the things that she was looking at and looking up and writing in that last week of her life, perhaps they could have done something. But Allie's response to it was to start a movement out in the Kansas City area that she called Speak Up. And she and another mom whose child also killed themselves, started this up. And it's all about just that. It says, hey, you have an issue? Talk about it. Speak up. Tell somebody about it. Don't keep this stuff inside and let it fester. And
it's the twofold, right? It's not only speak up, but help the people that are being spoken to understand how to respond. Because again, not to make people feel like they should hold blame and deal with that in a negative way, but to say that obviously how we respond is important. And like Lance said, very little education on that. I mean, again, I wonder of the people, of our listeners out there, if we asked you, if you're not somebody who's been affected by this, if one of your friends came up to you tonight and said, I want to kill myself, or something along the lines that were pretty clear, what would you do? And I wonder how many would have a succinct answer, because it's the tendency would be, well, I'm going to go to Google, right? And I'm going to figure out, okay, but you're sitting there and they're there with you. What do you do? And most people probably don't have a good idea of what to say.
What to do. That's a great point, because you think about, we're taught CPR and things like that.
Right.
The Heimlich maneuver, all of these life-saving things. We're either directly taught because we're somehow involved in some organization that's important, or we see it, but we have some knowledge. We have some knowledge, even if it's limited, on some of these things. But here is, like you said, it's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and the vast, vast majority of us have not a clue what to do, say, or how to act or anything if someone is at risk, or even says out loud, "Hey, I'm thinking of this." Our first inclination is, oh, you can't do that.
Right.
You think about everyone, we have a horrible.
Or that's silly. You don't really want to do. You don't mean that.
Yeah.
And we maybe unknowingly belittle them and make it worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think people too, like you said, John, it's, there's some things like CPR, the Heimlich maneuver, or just if somebody, falls over out of nowhere, we all know, right? Call 911. I mean, if nothing else, we know that's what you do. And there will be people who can help, who are professionals, who know what to do. I think a lot of people don't know, the assumption, I think, becomes that you should be the one to help them because they've sought your help. And it doesn't mean you can't help, but you have to think about, how are you qualified to help? Because it's definitely one of the mistakes I think a lot of people make, myself included, that you can, even if you don't think you're equipped, that you can become equipped in a time that works on the other person's schedule who's seeking your help. You can call 911 for if you're suicidal, and they have resources to get you through that moment of, you're thinking about it right now, and they can provide you a plethora of resources and connect you on the phone to other people who are even better qualified than they are to help. But again, Lance and I feel like we just always come back to that education thing, but you're right. It's not one of those things that people know what resources, what to do with that kind of information.
I don't know what the number is off the top of my head, but I would look up and ask you to look it up, and maybe we can give it, unless you guys have this information. There is a national suicide prevention hotline that's manned 24 hours a day. So, I mean, that's where I would go first if I felt like I couldn't handle it, is that I would, pull out my phone or my computer and make sure they have that number, because then it goes to people. Because I know for a while when we first moved here, my wife served on the hotline that was here. We had one in the county that people in this county. I'm not sure that still exists, but I'm almost positive
Yes, it does.
There's a national suicide hotline that's available 24 hours a day.
Yep. There's several different, there's several different organizations, but the National Suicide Prevention Hotline is available 24 hours a day. You can call them. They now have an online chat, and they also have an app. So there's a lot of different ways. And one of the benefits of the day we live in is that whatever method the person feels most comfortable with, they can approach. Because I think there are people who probably they haven't said the words to themselves, but they're thinking about it. And we talk a lot about you can defeat issues by naming them. And so often you wonder, how often have these people named it themselves? Because we think about the cases where people reach out for help, but again, in the cases where they don't, have they said those words to themselves? Because there's a lot of weight to them when you're forced to look at them. And so that might be part of the issue with, are people willing to call somebody if they can't say it to themselves? So you do have some other resources there in addition to that, all part of the same organization, where you've got those qualified people to give you some feedback.
Yeah. And Lance, I think you've got a really great idea of if you're speaking with somebody that is indicating that they are thinking about it, contemplating it. I think it's a great idea to just say, you know what, let's call this number together. I'm going to sit with you. You don't even have to talk. You can just whisper in my ear and I can tell them what you're thinking, whatever. But kind of a buddy system. I do want to go back to Allie just real quick and her Speak Up movement, because they actually were effective in getting some legislation in Kansas to add some education for teachers and administrators as part of their job duties. So they had to go through some of this education so that they knew what their response ought to be or what signs to look for. And
I know in my undergrad work, we had that. So I don't know each state
is different,
develops their own teachers in different ways. But even 38 years ago, I had that, some of that. And it's always usually available every couple of years in professional development, in training sessions that schools in Ohio have to do. That's usually a session that's covered, but each state is different. So I'm glad if Kansas didn't have anything like that they do, because you can't always see it, but there are signs that if you're aware and if you do what you said, if you smile and say hi to them on a regular basis, you can usually, not always, but usually pick up when there's something wrong. If you've made that initial attempt to contact them on their good days, you can see when there's a change. Or if you're reading their writing or you're looking at their notebook. Now, when you're talking about young people, you're talking about how 7 out of 10 were adult males. But with young people, you can look at their notebooks covers and there are all kinds of signs. So that's really good that they got that in Kansas if they didn't have anything like that already.
We know what else would be good. We talk about corporate training and things like that a lot on this show. And, that would be a good thing to add to the corporate training portfolio as well, at work.
Sure.
We every year we have to go through compliance training and other things like that. Hey, why not throw this?
You have to get trained on the new copy machine. Why can't you spend some time being trained on recognizing the signs of somebody who's struggling emotionally?
I should have checked that out before we did that show to see if any major brands are kind of leading the way on any of that. I don't know.
There's in the education component of it, I think part of it's there's a lot not to say, that again, I think people often will say without realizing it makes sense to them, especially because if this is somebody you care about, right, there's a chance that it's affecting you. And there's a lot more than a chance. It's almost certainly, to some degree, going to emotionally compromise you. And that leads back to thinking about, are you taking a breath before you're speaking and thinking about, why am I saying what I'm about to say? Is it because I'm hurt or I'm offended by what they're saying? Or is it from a place of that empathy, that attempt at understanding, or the compassion of wanting to help? Because a lot of times, reactionary psychology would tell us that most of the time, if you're reacting in that moment, a lot of it's going to come from what you are feeling in reaction to this, and not maybe so much what's the best to say to them. Frequent things like, your life isn't that bad, or suicide is selfish, or suicide is cowardly, or you don't mean that, you really don't want to die. All things that, again, from not being the person and from how you feel, can make sense to say because you think they might help, and they also reflect how you're feeling of, you don't think their life's that bad.
Right.
But obviously they do. So
right. It's only logical in the context of our own mind and
yes.
reality,
yes.
not in anyone else's.
Remembering that perception, I think, is a huge key, because assuming that, we think about it this way, so therefore, they're thinking about it the same way is, we know with the divisiveness in the country right now that that's obviously not the case. A lot of people think about things very differently. And so you can't make that assumption when you're responding.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, at least in what I've read, a huge part of it is listening, allowing them to say, or not saying anything.
Right.
Sometimes it's just being present.
Yep.
That can be a huge difference. Not feeling alone. Because, if you don't know what to say,
right.
It can be better to say nothing than to say something that
right.
could make it worse.
We're so eager to give advice.
Yes.
That you're absolutely right. Most times, giving advice is not the best solution.
Right.
Whether
Unless
it's
they ask,
it's as serious as potentially suicide, or just, hey, I'm having a bad day and I want to vent. Oh, well, let me tell you how you ought to handle this.
Right.
No,
that wasn't what they were looking for.
I just want to get it off my chest.
Yeah. We are quick to do that, and the best lesson we can learn is to just sit back and let someone talk and just listen for them. So. All right, guys. Well, look, I really appreciate you sitting in on this show and talking about this subject and sharing some of your own thoughts and experiences. It is one of those topics that I think you could talk about for hours, but we're going to have to wrap things up. So,
well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it, and you taking the initiative to bring this out here to the business community. And I really like your thought of, why can't there be something done in the workplace?
Yeah.
Especially with the number that you shared with, that just has resonated in my mind the whole show, because I come at it from a young person's perspective, being in education. But you talk about 7 out of 10 suicides are with middle-aged white males. That's huge. So no matter what we're doing in school, we're still not hitting the majority.
Yeah.
And it's taking place in the business world. So kudos to you to bring it up for people in that field to listen and say, hey, we need to do something about this. And what can we do? Where do we go?
Well, hey, if one person listens to this show and decides to get help or make a different decision than the one they are contemplating, then it is beyond worth our time. So,
absolutely. Well, yeah, thank you for having us on. Lance and I have talked about it. Now I remembered it. Lance and I have talked about it a number of times, and we harp, though, on all these heavy issues, and it is good that somebody, especially since that seems to be where it's hitting home the strongest in that area in business, is talking about it, because you would think if companies look at people as one of their biggest assets, then, you've got to care about not only their physical well-being, but their mental well-being as well. Possibly even more so than their physical. Because, they might be physically unhealthy, but they might still show up to work. And if they're mentally unhealthy, then you have to wonder, are they able to perform their job very well? So you would hope that even from just an analytical perspective, it would be of an appeal for businesses to look into, if not from a human perspective.
All right. Well, we're going to close things out here. Folks, you can listen to True Chat podcasts on Stitcher Radio or Apple Podcasts, as well as at truechat.org or on our app. For Business is Art on True Chat, I'm your host, John Umstead.
I'm Lance Jackson.
And I'm Justin T. Weller.
Thanks again for tuning in. Thank you guys for sitting in. Appreciate it very much. We'll see you next time on Business is Art. Be the change.
Looking for responsible media? Listen on demand to politics, sports, and more with the True Chat app or at truechat.org. Beyond the horizon, there is trustworthy media at True Chat.